The marble chambers of the Supreme Court carried their characteristic atmosphere of solemn formality as oral arguments proceeded on a case with profound implications for voting rights legislation. Justice Clarence Thomas sat in his customary position on the bench, his presence commanding attention despite his well-known preference for silence during most oral arguments. The case under consideration challenged provisions of a newly enacted federal voting rights law that Congress had passed to address documented patterns of voter suppression in multiple states. Jasmine Crockett stood at the lectern reserved for arguing attorneys, her role representing the House of Representatives as an amicus in support of the challenged legislation. Her selection for this extraordinary assignment reflected both her legal expertise as a former civil rights attorney and her deep knowledge of voting rights issues gained through her congressional work. What transpired over the next 45 minutes would become one of the most remarkable exchanges in recent Supreme Court history, forcing the justices and the nation to confront fundamental questions about constitutional interpretation, federalism, and the continuing relevance of racial discrimination in American democracy. Before examining this historic exchange that is reshaping legal debates about voting rights and congressional authority, please comment indicating your location and subscribe to ensure you receive updates on these critical developments affecting the foundations of American representative government. Justice Clarence Thomas had established himself over more than 3 decades on the Supreme Court as perhaps its most conservative member and one of its most distinctive constitutional thinkers. His jurisprudence emphasized originalism that sought to interpret constitutional provisions according to their original public meaning at the time of adoption. This interpretive methodology led Thomas to conclusions that often differed substantially from mainstream constitutional understandings, including narrow readings of congressional authority under the Commerce Clause and the 14th Amendment. His approach to voting rights cases reflected deep skepticism about federal intervention in state electoral processes, viewing such intervention as presumptively problematic, absent the clearest constitutional authorization. Thomas had authored or joined numerous opinions limiting the scope of the Voting Rights Act and questioning the constitutional foundations for congressional regulation of state voting procedures. His judicial philosophy held that racial classifications of any sort, even those intended to remedy discrimination, violated constitutional commitments to colorblind governance. This position placed him at odds with civil rights advocates who argued that addressing the ongoing effects of historical discrimination required race-conscious remedies. The case before the court challenged congressional findings that certain states had implemented voting restrictions that disproportionately affected minority voters in violation of constitutional protections. Congress had responded by enacting legislation requiring federal preclearance for certain categories of voting changes in jurisdictions with documented histories of discrimination. The law represented Congress's attempt to update the Voting Rights Act framework following Supreme Court decisions that had invalidated previous preclearance formulas. Congressional supporters argued that extensive factual findings documented continuing patterns of discrimination that justified federal oversight under the 14th and 15th Amendments. The challenged states contended that the legislation exceeded congressional authority by intruding on core state functions of regulating elections and by imposing burdens based on outdated assumptions about regional discrimination. Jasmine Crockett had been preparing for this oral argument for months, understanding that defending congressional authority before a conservative Supreme Court, skeptical of voting rights legislation, required mastery of both legal doctrine and factual record. Her background as a civil rights attorney had given her extensive experience litigating voting rights cases in federal courts across Texas. She understood intimately how seemingly neutral voting restrictions could operate to suppress minority participation through mechanisms ranging from strict identification requirements to limitations on early voting and reductions in 6 and S polling locations in minority neighborhoods. Her congressional work had involved reviewing thousands of pages of testimony and evidence documenting modern voter suppression tactics. This combination of litigation experience and legislative expertise positioned her uniquely to defend the challenged statute against constitutional attack. The oral argument began with Chief Justice Roberts posing questions about the constitutional foundations for congressional authority to regulate state voting procedures. Crockett responded by walking through the text and history of the Reconstruction Amendments, emphasizing that the 14th and 15th Amendments had been specifically designed to empower Congress to protect voting rights against state interference. She noted that the amendments included explicit enforcement provisions authorizing Congress to enact appropriate legislation, language that the framers had included precisely because they understood that constitutional guarantees required congressional implementation to be meaningful. Her responses combined careful textual analysis with historical understanding that demonstrated command of originalist methodology while reaching conclusions that supported federal voting rights protections. Justice Thomas had remained silent through the first 20 minutes of argument as other justices posed questions about various aspects of the challenged legislation. However, when Crockett began discussing congressional findings about continuing patterns of racial discrimination in voting, Thomas interrupted to pose a question that would begin an extended exchange, revealing fundamental disagreements about how courts should understand discrimination in contemporary America. The justice asked whether the Congresswoman truly believed that racial discrimination in voting remained a significant problem in the 21st century, or whether the legislation represented political efforts to advantage certain constituencies under the guise of civil rights protection. The question carried implicit skepticism that genuine discrimination persisted at levels justifying federal intervention in state electoral processes. Crockett paused briefly before responding with her first substantive engagement with Justice Thomas on the question of contemporary discrimination. She acknowledged that explicit racial barriers like literacy tests and poll taxes had been eliminated through previous civil rights legislation. However, she stated that the congressional record contained overwhelming evidence that discrimination had evolved into more sophisticated forms that achieved similar exclusionary purposes through facially neutral mechanisms. She cited specific examples from the evidentiary record, including statistical analyses showing that voting restrictions disproportionately affected minority voters, expert testimony about the pretextual nature of justifications offered for restrictive laws, and direct evidence of discriminatory intent from legislative deliberations. Her response emphasized that Congress had not acted based on assumptions or historical grievances, but rather on current data demonstrating ongoing discrimination. Justice Thomas followed up by questioning whether disparate impact on minority voters necessarily indicated discrimination rather than simply reflecting different preferences or behaviors across demographic groups. This second question pushed Crockett to address the methodological question of how courts should evaluate claims of voting discrimination when explicit racial classifications were absent. She responded that while disparate impact alone might not establish discrimination, the congressional record demonstrated that disparate impact combined with historical context, evidence of discriminatory purpose, and documented suppressive effects established clear patterns of discrimination that the 15th Amendment empowered Congress to address. Her second response built on the first by showing how multiple forms of evidence converged to demonstrate discrimination rather than relying on any single factor. The justice posed a third question, challenging whether federal oversight of state voting procedures violated principles of state sovereignty and federalism that the Constitution established. Crockett's third response addressed the relationship between state authority and federal civil rights protections by noting that the Reconstruction Amendments had fundamentally altered the original constitutional balance, precisely because state sovereignty had been abused to deny fundamental rights. She argued that when states used their authority over election procedures to suppress minority voting, they forfeited claims to autonomy in that domain because the 15th Amendment specifically authorized federal intervention to protect voting rights. Her response demonstrated understanding of federalism principles while explaining why those principles yielded to constitutional commitments to voting rights protection. Justice Thomas continued pressing with a fourth question about whether Congress had adequately considered less intrusive alternatives to preclearance requirements that would respect state sovereignty while addressing any remaining Congress discrimination. This question suggested that even if some federal role was appropriate, the challenged legislation went further than necessary to achieve legitimate purposes. Crockett's fourth response walked through the congressional record, showing extensive consideration of alternative approaches, including after-the-fact litigation and voluntary compliance mechanisms. She explained that Congress had concluded based on decades of experience that reactive litigation could not adequately protect voting rights because discriminatory laws often remained in effect through multiple election cycles before being invalidated. The preclearance mechanism represented the least intrusive means of actually preventing discrimination, rather than simply providing post hoc remedies after rights had been violated. The fifth question from Justice Thomas challenged whether preclearance requirements based on jurisdictional coverage formulas amounted to punishing current governments for historical discrimination by prior administrations. The question reflected concern that federal restrictions should not burden contemporary officials for past wrongdoing they played no role in committing. Crockett's fifth response distinguished between punishment and preventive measures by noting that preclearance requirements were not penalties for historical discrimination, but rather prophylactic rules justified by documented ongoing patterns of discriminatory voting changes. She emphasized that the coverage formula was based on current data showing which jurisdictions continued attempting discriminatory voting restrictions rather than simply relying on historical records. Her response reframed preclearance as forward-looking protection rather than backward-looking punishment. Justice Thomas posed a sixth question about whether the challenged legislation's focus on certain jurisdictions reflected regional bias rather than genuine concern about discrimination. This question suggested that congressional voting rights legislation might be animated by partisan considerations or regional prejudice, rather than neutral application of constitutional principles. Crockett's sixth response addressed this concern by noting that the coverage formula was based on objective criteria measuring actual discriminatory voting changes rather than geographic location. She pointed out that jurisdictions could exit preclearance requirements by demonstrating clean records, creating incentives for compliance rather than permanent stigmatization. Her response showed how the legislation's structure refuted claims of regional bias by tying federal oversight to demonstrated behavior rather than historical identity. The seventh question from Justice Thomas challenged congressional fact-finding by suggesting that legislators might have political incentives to exaggerate discrimination in order to justify expanded federal power. The question reflected skepticism about whether courts should defer to congressional judgments about the need for voting rights legislation. Crockett's seventh response defended congressional fact-finding authority by noting that the legislative record included testimony from thousands of witnesses, extensive documentary evidence, and rigorous statistical analysis that provided far more comprehensive factual development than typically occurred in judicial proceedings. She argued that the Constitution specifically assigned Congress rather than courts the primary responsibility for enforcing the Reconstruction Amendments through appropriate legislation, suggesting that judicial skepticism about congressional findings undermined the constitutional structure. Justice Thomas continued with an eighth question asking whether the challenged legislation's complexity and extensive requirements might actually burden legitimate state election administration efforts rather than simply preventing discrimination. This question suggested concern that voting rights protections might impose costs that exceeded their benefits. Crockett's eighth response acknowledged that preclearance created administrative requirements, but noted that these burdens were minimal compared to the fundamental importance of protecting voting rights. She pointed out that jurisdictions with clean records found preclearance requirements straightforward to satisfy, while only those attempting problematic changes faced significant scrutiny. Her response reframed administrative burdens as appropriate costs of ensuring constitutional compliance, rather than as excessive impositions on state sovereignty. The ninth question from Justice Thomas represented his most direct challenge to the foundations of the challenged legislation. He asked whether the entire framework of the Voting Rights Act and its congressional updates rested on the assumption that certain regions or jurisdictions were inherently discriminatory in ways that required permanent federal supervision, an assumption the justice suggested violated constitutional commitments to equality among states. This question struck at the fundamental legitimacy of voting rights legislation by characterizing it as reflecting prejudice against certain jurisdictions rather than neutral protection of rights. The question was designed to force Crockett either to defend differential treatment of states or to concede that voting rights legislation lacked coherent constitutional foundations. Crockett's ninth response would floor Justice Thomas and transform the entire trajectory of the oral argument. She stated with quiet intensity that the question reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what voting rights legislation actually did and what discrimination it addressed. She explained that the Voting Rights Act did not assume certain jurisdictions were inherently discriminatory, but rather responded to documented evidence that certain jurisdictions had repeatedly attempted to implement discriminatory voting changes despite federal protections. The legislation created accountability mechanisms that any jurisdiction could avoid simply by respecting voting rights, making compliance rather than geography the relevant criterion. She noted that framing voting rights protections as prejudice against jurisdictions inverted the actual constitutional violation by characterizing accountability for discrimination as itself discriminatory. Her response suggested that the premise of Justice Thomas's question revealed the extent to which opponents of voting rights legislation had succeeded in reframing civil rights protections as the true constitutional problem rather than the discrimination those protections addressed. The courtroom fell into profound silence following this ninth response as justices, attorneys, and observers absorbed what Crockett had articulated. She had not simply answered Justice Thomas's question, but had exposed the rhetorical strategy underlying much conservative opposition to voting rights legislation. By characterizing federal oversight as prejudice against certain jurisdictions, opponents attempted to claim victim status for governments that had repeatedly violated constitutional rights. This inversion allowed them to appeal to equality principles and constitutional tradition while actually defending practices that denied political equality to minority citizens. Crockett's response stripped away this rhetorical camouflage and forced direct confrontation with whether the Constitution permitted Congress to prevent states from suppressing minority voting. Justice Thomas's face registered that he had not anticipated such a direct challenge to the premises underlying his questions. Other justices leaned forward, recognizing that Crockett had shifted the argument in ways that complicated their ability to invalidate the challenged legislation without explicitly stating that preventing voter suppression exceeded congressional authority. The conservative justices who had appeared inclined to strike down the law now faced the uncomfortable prospect of issuing a decision that would be widely understood as gutting federal voting rights protections, despite overwhelming congressional findings of continuing discrimination. The remainder of the oral argument proceeded with questions from other justices that reflected the impact of Crockett's exchange with Justice Thomas. Several justices asked about specific provisions of the challenged legislation in ways that suggested they were seeking grounds to uphold at least substantial portions rather than invalidating the entire framework. Questions focused on whether certain aspects of the law were severable if the court found other provisions problematic, whether the congressional record adequately supported particular elements, and whether modifications to the preclearance formula might address federalism concerns while preserving core protections. The tone had shifted from whether federal voting rights legislation exceeded constitutional authority to how such legislation should be structured to satisfy constitutional requirements. The immediate reaction to the oral argument reflected widespread recognition that something extraordinary had occurred. Legal commentators noted that Crockett's performance represented one of the most effective defenses of voting rights legislation before the Supreme Court in decades. Her combination of doctrinal sophistication, command of the factual record, and willingness to directly challenge the premises of hostile questioning had altered the trajectory of an argument that had appeared likely to result in invalidation of significant portions of the challenged law. The exchange with Justice Thomas particularly captured attention because she had not simply responded to his questions but had forced him to confront whether his jurisprudence privileged state sovereignty over constitutional protections for minority voting rights. Progressive legal scholars and civil rights advocates celebrated Crockett's performance as demonstrating how effective lawyering could defend voting rights even before a hostile Supreme Court. They noted that her ninth response to Justice Thomas had articulated a point that civil rights advocates had struggled to convey effectively, namely that characterizing voting rights protections as prejudice against jurisdictions represented a fundamental distortion that treated accountability for discrimination as the true constitutional violation. This rhetorical clarity helped cut through decades of conservative legal arguments that had successfully reframed civil rights protections as themselves problematic rather than addressing the underlying discrimination. Conservative legal commentators struggled to defend Justice Thomas's line of questioning after Crockett had exposed its premises so directly. Some attempted to argue that concerns about state sovereignty and federal overreach remained legitimate even if civil rights protections were important. But this response failed to address how those concerns should be balanced when states repeatedly attempted to suppress minority voting. Others suggested that Crockett had been inappropriately aggressive in her responses to a Supreme Court justice, but this characterization was difficult to sustain given that she had maintained respectful demeanor throughout while simply answering questions directly and completely. The Supreme Court ultimately issued a decision several months later that upheld substantial portions of the challenged voting rights legislation while modifying certain aspects of the preclearance formula to address federalism concerns. The decision represented a significant victory for voting rights advocates, given the court's conservative composition and its recent history of limiting federal voting rights protections. Legal observers attributed the unexpectedly favorable outcome at least partially to Crockett's performance during oral arguments, which had made clear to the justices that invalidating the legislation would be widely understood as endorsing voter suppression rather than simply protecting state sovereignty. For Jasmine Crockett personally, the Supreme Court argument significantly elevated her standing within both the legal profession and democratic politics. She had demonstrated capability to function at the highest levels of constitutional litigation while defending progressive priorities against sophisticated conservative legal challenges. Her performance suggested potential for future high-level appointments, including federal judgeships or other positions requiring exceptional legal acumen. The viral nature of her exchange with Justice Thomas ensured that her voice would carry substantial weight in future voting rights debates, and that she would be sought out as a spokesperson on civil rights issues. The broader implications extended to debates about originalism and constitutional interpretation. Crockett had demonstrated that originalist methodology did not inevitably lead to conservative political outcomes when applied rigorously to the text and history of the Reconstruction Amendments. The 14th and 15th Amendments had been specifically designed to authorize federal protection of civil rights against state interference, meaning that originalist interpretation should support rather than undermine voting rights legislation. Her performance suggested that progressive lawyers needed to engage more confidently with originalist arguments rather than ceding that interpretive ground to conservatives who deployed originalism selectively to support predetermined political preferences. The exchange also highlighted questions about the relationship between legal doctrine and political commitments in constitutional adjudication. Justice Thomas's questions had reflected not simply neutral application of constitutional principles, but rather deep skepticism about whether racial discrimination remained a significant problem in contemporary America. This skepticism shaped how he evaluated congressional findings and how he balanced state sovereignty against voting rights protections. Crockett's responses had forced confrontation with whether constitutional interpretation was genuinely neutral, or whether it reflected prior commitments about the nature and severity of discrimination in American society. Thanks for watching this historic exchange between Justice Clarence Thomas and Jasmine Crockett that demonstrates how effective legal advocacy can defend fundamental rights even before skeptical courts, and how direct engagement with hostile questioning can expose weaknesses in opposing arguments. This oral argument represents a defining moment in contemporary voting rights litigation, with implications that will shape American democracy for generations. Please subscribe immediately and activate notifications to ensure you receive all significant developments as the Supreme Court issues its decision and as voting rights debates continue shaping electoral access across the nation. Share your perspective in the comments regarding this exchange, and whether you believe Crockett's defense of congressional authority will succeed in preserving federal voting rights protections, or whether the conservative court majority will find grounds to limit those protections despite her compelling advocacy. Our coverage will track all implications of this case for voting rights enforcement, and will examine how the legal and constitutional questions raised during this oral argument influence broader debates about federalism, congressional authority, and the continuing relevance of racial discrimination in American political institutions. So subscribe now to remain informed on these crucial developments that determine whether all Americans will have meaningful access to the ballot, or whether voting rights protections will be dismantled in the name of state sovereignty and colorblind constitutionalism.